When I was 10 years old, I lived in a very small town, 1,000 people or so, and I lived 15 minutes from town in the woods. My dad and I were watching his friend's house, which was about 3 to 4 miles from our own, and just so happened to live closer to my friend's house. So one day after school, I begged my dad to let me walk to my friend's house, and eventually, he let me. There's not much in between the houses, and she lived about a half a mile away. At almost the halfway mark, this guy pulls up and asks me where some road was. I knew not to talk to strangers, so I just pointed behind me as I kept walking. He then started asking me questions, like where I lived, why I was walking in the rain. It was barely drizzling and I had a raincoat on. He then stops his car and says, "I can't let you walk in this. Let me take you home." Now, deer in headlights is real, and I completely froze. I wish I could say I ran, that I fought, but I was basically a mannequin, kinda like an ostrich with its head in the sand, but my neck wasn't that long, and it was just mud. He asked where I lived, and kept missing the turns. We drove past a restaurant, and I lied and said my aunt was working, and he could drop me off there. He said he would, but when he didn't, that's the exact moment I realized I was in trouble. I'm not going to get into detail because it's not required, but I'll just say that he took me deep into the woods, and on the way there, I kept trying to figure out what he wanted from me. I thought about every situation, from trying to get money from my family to making me a slave. But what he did to me, I somehow didn't expect. It was like I thought that stuff didn't happen. I had never heard of it before. And that night, I lost a lot of innocence. 16 hours later, he tried to strangle me to death, but I kept kicking his window, and apparently he would rather have a window than kill me. He told me to turn the opposite way and start walking. He told me earlier that he had a gun. I thought he was going to shoot me in the back of the head, but he just drove off. Luckily, I knew where I was, generally speaking. My bus went past where we were every morning. Yes, it sucked having to see it every day. So I walked to the nearest house that I knew had kids. It was about 5 miles away, and every time a car would get close, I would run and hide in the woods, just in case it was him to come back and finish me off. A few times I didn't make it, and every single one of them would stop and ask if I were one of those kids who ran away. Yup, I guess some kids ran away and people were looking out for them. That made me feel real shitty. I thought no one was looking for me, but I always shook my head and lied and pointed to a random house and said I lived there. I don't know how long it took me, but I eventually made it to the house with the kids and knocked on their door. I remember the mom answered the door, and I blurted out what happened to me and asked to use her phone. She kept asking me what I said because she couldn't comprehend it. So I gave up trying to explain myself and begged to use her phone. I tried calling my dad, busy. My grandma, busy. Uncle, also busy. I remember thinking, man, they must all be talking with each other and planning out a fun day that I'm going to miss out on. I didn't know what to do, and I started crying. The lady said she could give me a ride home, and I agreed. I remember getting close to the house and seeing a ton of cars. Some were cop cars, lights and all. I remember thinking, this is why everyone was on the phone. They were finally organizing a parade down our road. I never got to experience many parades, and secretly wanted one on my road. Everyone was backed up, and what I didn't know then was that they were searching every car. Then I saw my dad, and I practically yelled, "That's my dad." And I guess he heard me yelling, looked right at me, and said, "She's here." And I jumped out of the lady's truck and went to run to him, but the police grabbed me and threw me into the back of their car. I just wanted to go home. The rest of the day is a blur. I don't remember much, and the only reason I remember what I do, yes, every little detail, because for over a year afterwards, once every couple of weeks, I was forced to retell what happened to me up until that point in a courtroom, so my memory would stay fresh until he was caught. Besides the act, the hardest part was that everyone in town knew. So in a messed up way, I was a celebrity. I couldn't ride the bus in peace because the radio would mention what happened to me and everyone would stare at me. Kids called me a whore. There were rumors that I was pregnant, that I asked for it, etc. One girl acted like my friend for months, just to get me to talk about what happened. Then she stopped being my friend and lied to her other friends about what happened to me. It took me years to trust anyone again, and I was terrified of everyone. I remember my dad took me to the store, and I stayed in the car while he went in. A man pulled up next to us, and I was already scared. But then he came up to the car and said, "You're Dorothy, aren't you?" I was so incredibly scared. I had no idea who he was. But then he introduced himself as Sarah's boyfriend, a woman my dad used to date. But that made no difference to me. He was a stranger and a man. I started to panic, but looking at me, you wouldn't tell unless you got close, as there were tears in my eyes and I had peed a little. I was slowly rolling up my window and locked the door. The guy kept talking. About what? No idea. I could only hear waves. He eventually said goodbye and walked into the store. My dad came out and saw how freaked out I was and wanted to go fight the guy, but it wasn't his fault, and I begged my dad not to. Years later, I saw Sarah, and she immediately apologized to me. She said that her boyfriend didn't know what had just happened to me and feels terrible for scaring me. Apparently, he did notice. The guy who kidnapped me was caught a little over a year later and he's in prison for life. Sometimes I think, what if he did succeed in killing me, and this life with terrorist attacks, COVID, Nazis in the street is just a nightmare before actual death? You wouldn't be able to find any of this online because it happened before the internet and in a small town no one cares about. Sometimes I feel like I would like to write to him and maybe forgive him, but I haven't fully yet. Maybe eventually. In 2020, at the beginning of COVID, I had just given birth. At this time, I could only have one other person in the room with me my entire stay at the hospital. Of course, my kid's father was there, but like the third day, he left to clean up our house and get everything prepared for me and the baby. I had gotten sick and had a C-section, so I had to stay for about 4 to 5 days. Well, while he was away, a nurse named Kelly said she would be helping me throughout the day and spending time with me so I don't feel lonely while Dad is gone. I couldn't really hold my baby due to me being sick and the pain from the C-section. So my nurses would come in every time it was time to feed. I noticed when they came in, they wouldn't acknowledge Kelly, and she would go to the farthest part of the room and she would tell me, "I'm just gonna get out the way." Now she did tell me that she didn't specialize in what they did, and she was just there for comfort. So I didn't question anything. I really believe I would have broken down if she wasn't in there with me. She was such a sweetheart. Well, after about 5 or 6 hours, she told me she had to leave and that she would come visit me before her shift was over to see how I was doing. She hugged me and blew a kiss at my baby and walked out the room. Later that night, Dad came back and he was very upset. He had told me some stuff happened with his mom and that he's sorry he took so long. I was upset, but I told him a nurse named Kelly kept me company. As I'm telling him about her, my nurse is changing my sheets, and she's like, "Who is Kelly?" I explained, and she said that nobody named Kelly was in my room or working that day. So I instantly thought about those women who would pretend to be nurses and kidnap children. But my nurse told me that I may be hallucinating, and she told my doctor. I talked to my doctor, and he said the same thing. Well, a couple of hours later, a nurse that I didn't recognize came in my room and said, "I know this might sound crazy, but everyone on the floor is talking about how you seen Kelly." I said, "Yeah, she was here with me for like 7 hours today, and she helped out a lot." We are smiling and laughing while I was telling her about Kelly and how sweet and funny she was. Then she pulled up her phone and showed me pictures of her and Kelly that looked like to be maybe early 2000s. I was smiling, knowing I wasn't hallucinating, Then she sat down and told me Kelly died over 10 years ago from domestic violence with her boyfriend. I wasn't too shocked because my entire life I've been dealing with paranormal. But I got chills because I never had an encounter this deep. Well, the lady gave me a hug and started crying, saying, "Now I know that she is okay." Since that day, I've been wondering, why did Kelly come in my room and help me? I kinda wish I could see her again. I grew up in a house that, years after we moved in, found to have a hidden torture chamber behind a false wall in the basement. A lot of unexplained things happened during the 14 years we lived there. One that particularly stands out happened when I was in my last year of elementary school. My youngest brother left. My mom went to work, and she would drop him off at preschool. My other siblings all were in junior high or high school and left earlier than me, as their school started an hour earlier than mine. My father left before everyone at 5 a.m. every morning for work, so I was always the last one to leave on school days. One of my brothers, who was later diagnosed as bipolar, got into drugs the year before, so my parents put a deadbolt on their room to stop him from taking money and things to sell. It was always locked when they left, and this morning was no exception. I left as usual, got about a block and a half away, and realized I forgot my math book. I ran back. I'd been gone 3, maybe 4 minutes, but upon opening the door, so much had changed. My parents' bedroom door was wide open, the stereo on. It hadn't been on when I left. The door beside their dresser, which led to a second-story porch, was also open. Nobody in the room, nobody on the porch. Worse, though, was the door to the attic being open. It was never left open. I peered through the doorway, and halfway up the stairs was our dog. She was a teacup poodle, small and very sweet, but right now she was standing, shaking on the stairs, her teeth bared, emitting a very low growl. I went up as quietly as I could, keeping my eye on the dark blob of shadows at the top of the stairs. I'd just gotten to where I could reach her when it felt like a breeze hit me, carrying a sickly sweet but rotten smell, not unlike the bottom of a well-used garbage can. There were no open windows in the attic. I reached down to pick up the dog, and when I looked up again, the shadow blob had moved. Scared now, I snatched the dog and ran down the stairs, slamming the door shut. I ran down the other stairs to the first floor, still holding the dog, and out the door. I never told anyone about it. When I went home that day, my parents had no mention of the door being open or the stereo on. So I'm guessing that things were set right before they got there. I don't know who could have been there. Was someone living in my attic? But even more scarier, how long were they there? I just hope to think these are conspiracies and me overthinking it. For the rest of that school year, I went to my friend's house every morning to walk to school with her after my siblings left.